Tariff refunds could be coming to companies across the country later this year. That's after the Supreme Court struck down some of the tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump that affected countries around the world. East Texas News' Michael Richardson spoke with economist Dr. Ray Perryman and Congressman Pete Sessions about the tariff reimbursements.
To begin refunding certain tariffs, Customs and Border Protection says it needs around a month and a half.
At first, there was really no appetite whatsoever to process these refunds. These court decisions have expedited that and given a little more sense of urgency, which I was happy to see.
East Texas economist Dr. Ray Perryman says manufacturers who paid the tariffs would be eligible for refunds.
About $130 billion or so of these excess tariffs were paid, and the people who actually paid the tariffs as the goods came into the United States are entitled to refunds.
If there's going to be taxation of tariffs, Congress, in my opinion, should be consulted.
If the money is reimbursed, Congressman Pete Sessions says he wants it to go to a particular industry.
The decision would mean that we should release a good portion of this to the farming ranching community, those involved in agriculture.
Perryman adds the reimbursement process is a complex one, involving over 300,000 eligible recipients. Michael Richardson, East Texas News Weekend.
Perryman tells us it's not clear how much Texas could be reimbursed from the tariffs, but says that it could be tens of billions of dollars.